The world's largest fertilizer company is warning that the Iran conflict could put billions of meals at risk, triggering food shortages and price spikes that would hit Africa's poorest communities hardest, while U.S. Central Command is reportedly pushing for the first-ever deployment of hypersonic Dark Eagle missiles to the region as the conflict intensifies. This isn't a distant geopolitical abstraction anymore. This is food on tables, inflation in supermarkets, and a military escalation that could reshape the entire Middle East. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is Yara's CEO crying wolf, or are we genuinely staring down a global food catastrophe?
Thanks, Emma. And no, Svein Tore Holsether is absolutely not crying wolf. This man runs the largest fertilizer company on the planet. His entire business model depends on getting these supply projections right. When he talks about a global auction where the poorest nations simply can't compete, he is describing a market dynamic that we've already witnessed once, during the Ukraine crisis, when fertilizer prices spiked over 200% and African agricultural systems buckled. Iran is a top 15 global urea producer. The Persian Gulf corridor handles a massive share of global ammonia and fertilizer feedstock trade. Any sustained disruption to Hormuz shipping doesn't just hurt oil prices, it cripples the nitrogen fertilizer supply chain that feeds literally billions of people. Douglas Murray has argued for years that Western strategic weakness has real civilizational costs. And here we are, watching those costs land on African farmers who had nothing to do with decades of failed Iran policy. And the uncomfortable truth is, this crisis was made possible by years of appeasement that treated Tehran as a negotiating partner rather than the destabilizing force it actually is.
But Sophia, isn't that being somewhat reductive? The Iran nuclear deal, whatever its flaws, was designed to prevent exactly the kind of military escalation we're now seeing, and critics argued at the time that abandoning it would lead to precisely this instability. Doesn't some of the blame sit with those who walked away from diplomacy? And James, what's your take on this?
Well, look, I think Sophia is right about the supply chain vulnerability, but I'd push back on the framing that this is purely a story of Western weakness. Here's what I think is being missed. The structural fragility in global fertilizer markets predates Iran policy by decades. We built a global agricultural system that is dangerously concentrated. A handful of choke points, a handful of producers, almost zero redundancy. The real policy failure isn't just about Iran. It's that free market principles were abandoned in favor of hyper-globalized dependency without any serious risk assessment. We've known since at least 2022, when Sri Lanka's fertilizer ban contributed to national economic collapse, that this system has catastrophic single points of failure. The CENTCOM Dark Eagle request tells me the military understands the escalation risk, but we should be equally alarmed that nobody in Washington or Brussels was building strategic fertilizer reserves or incentivizing domestic production capacity when they had the chance.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. Yes, there are structural market issues, but you don't fix structural market issues while a ballistic missile crisis is unfolding in the Persian Gulf. The reason we're talking about Dark Eagle hypersonic missiles is that Iran moved its launchers beyond existing U.S. strike range. That's not a supply chain problem. That's an adversary that has been allowed to develop capabilities unchecked. Ben Shapiro has made this point repeatedly, and it's correct. You cannot separate the food security crisis from the strategic failure. Appeasement doesn't produce stability. It produces this. It produces a situation where CENTCOM needs its most advanced hypersonic asset just to stay in the game. That's not a market failure. That's the price of a decade of pretending Tehran would moderate if we were just nice enough to them.
Here's what I want to know, because this affects real people right now. If this conflict continues at its current intensity through the planting season, are we looking at actual famine conditions in parts of Africa, and what does that then trigger geopolitically? James, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, and the data supports this, is that we're heading into a critical 6 to 8 week window. The Northern Hemisphere planting season is already underway. If fertilizer supply disruptions persist through that window, the yield impact becomes locked in for 2026 harvests. We saw in 2022 that food price shocks of this magnitude generate refugee pressure, political destabilization, and the conditions for extremist recruitment in the Sahel and East Africa. The trajectory suggests we could see a compounding crisis, food insecurity feeding political instability, which then becomes a security problem that lands back on Western governments' desks in the form of migration pressure and conflict escalation. And with the Bank of England already warning UK inflation could hit 6%, the Western economic buffer for absorbing a global food shock is thinner than it looks.
Here's what concerns me most, and I think this is the scenario nobody in the mainstream media wants to discuss. If the US deploys Dark Eagle and the conflict escalates toward direct strikes on Iranian ballistic missile infrastructure, we are potentially talking about Hormuz as an active contested waterway. 20% of global oil transits that strait. The fertilizer feedstock that goes through there doesn't get replaced by emergency UN funds. If that strait is effectively closed for even a matter of weeks, we're not talking about food price inflation. We're talking about a supply shock that makes 2022 look like a warm-up. The real risk here is that the window between Iranian regime pressure and Iranian regime collapse is where the most dangerous, most desperate decisions get made. And I genuinely don't know if the current policy architecture in Washington is thinking 3 moves ahead on that.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen. Extraordinary analysis on an extraordinary story. One thing's certain, somewhere between the fertilizer terminals of the Persian Gulf and the farm fields of sub-Saharan Africa, the bill for 30 years of failed Middle East policy is finally coming due.